Third and final time in the records room, looking at all the Decepticon factions. In this one, we got the bots that strip off other organisms' skins and use them as a disguise. I got the many type of Seekers. I'm going to try and picture what the Demonicons look like, as well as maybe the Maraudicons. So please make sure you like and subscribe. It really does help keep the channel going. And let's start with Squadron X, the Wreckers' evil opposites who specialize in leaving a wake of indiscriminate corpses in their way. As such, the Wreckers' leader, Impactor, was obsessed with tracking them down and ending them. After Valve switched sides from the Wreckers for reasons that we're never told, he became leader of Squadron X and set about recruiting only the most brutal and deranged bots, one of which would eventually take his place as leader, a bot called Macabre, the most insane and violent bot around, so much so that even his troops weren't
Third
certain
and final
what
time
he'd
in
do
the
at any
records
given
room,
moment.
looking at
like
all
he was
the
just as likely to
Decepticon
turn on them
factions.
when things
In
weren't
this
going
part,
his
we got
way.
the bots that
New
strip off
recruits
other
were
organisms
expected
to
to die
skins
so
and use
quickly
them
that
as a
all the bots
disguise.
didn't even
I got
bother
the
learning
many
their names.
types
In the
of
Wings
Seekers
universe, they set up
to
an
try
ambush
and
for the
picture
Wreckers,
what
but
the
then
Demonicons
show up.
look
So
like.
Macabre's men
As
started
well
whinging,
as the
so he
Maraudicons.
ordered that no
Please
one
make
would
sure
move
you like
until
and
they did
subscribe.
show
It really
up.
does
They
help
stayed
keep
there
the
so
channel
long
going.
that his men
And
started to
let's
go crazy,
start
and eventually this
with
bot called
Squadron
Earthquake
X.
strapped himself full of explosives and blew himself and Macabre to smithereens. Squadron X eventually met their end when Impactor and his crew finally cornered them on planet Pova, and when Prowl ordered them to release the Decepticons because planet Pova was a neutral planet and they weren't meant to be there in the first place, Impactor executed every last one of them. As with the Autobots, the Decepticons had their own pretenders. Robots that would disguise themselves as fearsome creatures from a variety of freak planets. I mean, look at this guy. What the hell planet did he come from? They did this by using a pretender shell, which sounds a lot like the bioorganic Beast Wars alt modes. But with the added bonus that the shell could separate off from the inner robot and function as another bot, being controlled by the inner bot. Like imagine if you had a suit of armor that you could then take off and have it go some shit up while you sit down and have a coffee. Catch is, though, that you'll feel all the pain that's inflicted on this dude. Yeah, that's how it works. Anyway, there were the pretender beasts, Carnivac, Catilla, Chainclaw, and Snarler, as well as Bludgeon, Double-Headed, Longtooth, Pincher, and Stranglehold, among others. In the Marvel comics, this whole technology was created by Scorponok, and in the IDW comics, the text was originally created by Thunderwing, who would strip the flesh off of unwilling participants and use it to create these skins that were still alive. If I've got this right, he then tested the technology on himself, making himself hugely powerful, but driving himself insane in the process. And he would ultimately set off a chain of events that would render Cybertron too hostile for Cybertronian life. Bludgeon was the next to try the process, but he rushed it and ended up in a coma inside his new shell. Then there were the pretender monsters from IDW: Bristleback, Icepick, Scowl, Slog, Wildfly, and Birdbrain. Nova Prime created these things, trying to create a super smart, super strong being that would be the realization of Nexus Prime's lost art of combination. Seeing that they'd instantly gone crazy, Omega Supreme locked them in a dimensionally displaced prison. But after several millennia, they managed to escape, tracking down Omega for a revenge, combining into Monstructor, and giving Omega a right slapping. Optimus only managed to beat it because he knew of its inherent weakness, which is one I can't remember right now. I guess it was weak to Robo Jesus plot armor. I don't know. Anyway, they ended up fighting on Unicron's side, savagely tearing Victorion to pieces to clear the way for Unicron's approach before Victoria got her shit back together and her and Superion killed him. But we're not done with pretenders yet. There were also double pretenders that were mentioned in Shattered Glass and a few other places. And get your brain ready for this. These guys had two robots in one pretender shell, so three beings with the same mind that once they were out of the shell could combine with each other. There was Oilmaster, who was this gorilla that was armed to the teeth, dripping with acid, and was apparently one of the Con's most feared bounty hunters. He would have huge fits of rage when his shell took damage. Then there was this spider guy that I can't really find out that much about. For some reason, the Decepticons hired these car thieves to steal 500 cars, which were then modified by the Constructicons into the robot conversion troop. They were surprisingly effective, but again, the Autobots figured out how to jam their remote signal before destroying their factory, and jobs are good 'un. Ooh, quick update / correction. Remember the Gyronian sentry that I talked about in the last video that got Robo Smashed by the Robo Smasher?
Smash!
Well, he might not have been an Autobot at all, but loyal to Gyronia. Gyronia, the loveliest place in the world, we think. Thing is, we don't know what Gyronia was, so he does belong on this list because he got Robo Smashed by the Robo Smasher.
Smash!
But there's a question mark as to whether he belongs on the last list. Do you care? No. Okay, I'll shut up.
Smash!
The Stormtroopers, yes, insert Star Wars joke here. were the evil opposites to the Autobots Aqua Speeders and consisted of a group of bots that would spooge out high-pressure fluids. Aqua Blast was kind of their version of Ratchet, Drench was the coordinator of the group, Hydra Dread was the science officer, and Rage was the leader. They destroyed London in the Gen 2 comics, then worked under a Decepticon called Turmoil in the IDW line. There was a mutiny by a bot called Deadlock, and Drench was killed in the conflict. Later, Rage & Co. would try and liberate Megatron, but failed pretty hard. There was the three-man strike Team Ura from the movie comics, where they were dispatched by Shockwave to investigate a secretive human organization called the Initiative, whose main aim was to adapt Cybertronian tech to serve their nefarious purposes, and to eventually create their own version of the Allspark. Basically, these guys managed to get hold of Ravage's remains after he was destroyed in Giza, and rebuilt him so that they could send him on their own missions. Anyway, Shockwave dispatched these guys, but they didn't last long. Breakdown and Reverb were killed by the Autobots, and their leader, Dirt Boss, this green forklift truck, just about managed to escape. Team Kaon was led by Clench in Transformers Animated, which was one of only 2 teams that Megatron dispatched to actually successfully execute their orders, in this case, taking a space bridge. Team Stream was a field team that did a lot of escort work. No, not that kind of escort work. It was led by Slipstream and featured Sunstorm, Flame War, Shadow Striker, Tracer, Hyperdrive, and Blackjack. Oh, and Astro Train too. They worked for the Rise and Shockwave, who assigned them to escort a city speaker called Skystalker on a mission to hack a hub so that the city speaker could upload a data bomb to all of the Titans in orbit and set Vigilem on a rampage to destroy the Tether. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out the Fates of the Titans vid that I did. I talk about it more in the section on Vigilem. They were sent to ambush Optimus Prime. They didn't get Prime, but they did get Magnus and handed him over to Megatron. Anyway, they later escorted Devastator to a huge battle, which was an attempt to stop the Autobots leaving Cybertron. The Autobots managed to gain orbit, but at the expense of Computron, who put himself in the way of a massive barrage. I talked about that already, right? As I mentioned before, though, he didn't die, and Team Stream took his component bots into custody. The Triggercons were Windsweeper, Ruckus, and Crankcase, and in terms of size to power ratio, they were probably the ones who packed the most wallop, being these small little tiny dudes with massive shooters. As naming conventions would dictate, they would go up against the Triggerbots, and they were support troops that were pretty loyal to Megatron, even saving him once when another faction called the Triumvirate tried to shoot him in the back. They later surrendered to the Autobots when their commander Thunderwing grew increasingly volatile and even tried to kill them. Speaking of the Triumvirate, they were a trio of bots that managed to nab control of the Decepticons following the death of Straxus in the Marvel comic. They lost interest in destroying the Autobots, their focus shifting to gladiator fights instead, sadistically throwing weaker Autobots in with bigger, brutal cons. They made the mistake of throwing Megatron into the pits though, and of course, he decimated all, then gave a speech about what it meant to be a Decepticon. So the rest of the cons were inspired by his words, turned on the Triumvirate, and ousted them from power. And shortly after that, they tried to assassinate Megsy, and well, you know what happened. You know what they say, if it looks like Scourge, if it sounds like Scourge, if it's indistinguishable from Scourge in every conceivable way, it ain't Scourge, it's the Sweeps. These space boats, or space skiffs as they're technically known, they don't actually have individual names, and as such, often get treated like ass, especially by Galvatron, who blasts them every time he sees them pretty much. They were also in the Headmasters cartoon, helping to sabotage Autobot rescue ops, and slightly more bizarrely, they were caught in a black hole explosion that made their bodies shrink, but not their heads. And in the IDW comics, they were created when Galvatron got pissed off with Scourge and threw him into a solar pool, which not only rejuvenated him, but also cloned him right good a bunch of times. A few of them got zombified by a multiversal virus called the Undermined. Jumping to Transformers Energon, the Eclipse team were Mirage, Sharkticon, and Slugslinger, who once had to crawl through a sewer to steal refined Energon, but other than that, weren't really all that interesting. I've no idea why they were called the Eclipse team. The Demonicons are ones that I couldn't really find out all that much about, but they were mentioned in one of the annuals somewhere, and just have so much potential. They were Decepticons, although there might have been a few Autobots in there as well, that were possessed by evil spirits. Until, of course, they were exorcised by everyone's favorite Robo-Jesus. Okay, it's an obvious joke, but I gotta do it. The power of Primus compels! The known Guncons were Rapid Fire and Zuka. Now, we don't know anything about the other Guncons, so I've come up with a few of my own names for them. There was Recoiltron, who kicked like a mule. Boobytron. No, this sucks. The whole bunch of them died under unspecified circumstances, apart from Rapid Fire, who was saved by the Necrobot and placed in a stasis capsule. When he woke up, though, he found that the Autobots had won the war, so he set up another small contingent to set it right. But he ended up having his head blown off by Red Alert. If you haven't passed the rite of the Decepticon, you'd get nicknamed a Genericon, to be used as fodder until you survived long enough to prove that you were worthy to wear the patch. And it was kind of what it sounded like. It was kind of a painful branding of the Decepticon logo go into a bot's steely flesh, and the reciting of an oath pledging loyalty to Megatron and the cause, in front of either Megatron himself or the Conclave, who we'll talk about again later. Some of you might remember Predatron from my video on the Predacons.
Sure.
So he was apparently the first Predacon. Well, he had his own faction too, called the Destronger, which was kind of like a war council that would eventually be destroyed, whoa, I farted, which would eventually be destroyed by Deathsaurus. There were these three weirdos who made up the Tripredus Council, who would sit in this darkened room which was inside Unicron's head, if memory serves, pulling the strings for various nefarious schemes. After the Predacon alliance was fractured, these guys became one of the many ruling bodies on Cybertron, and it's been suggested that they are not in fact Cybertronians, but possibly extraterrestrial, or maybe even creations of Unicron. Another aerial unit were the Sky Scorchers, who were loyal to Bludgeon in the Marvel Gen 2 continuity, even against Megatron. Hawk and Pterodive were killed in the conflict, leaving only Tornado and Snipe. In Regeneration 1, they tried to steal missile warheads from a decommissioning depot in Callis, but they weren't the most competent, let's just say, so Soundwave made up his mind that they should be made martyrs of, and sent some Insecticons to make sure they died while trying to set the warheads off. Thermidor was a Lobstercon, and although animated implied that there were more of these, I'm pretty sure he was the only one you ever saw, wasn't he? I would love to see more of these, although I don't need him to be a pirate, to be fair. In the 3H comics, Roulette and Shadow Striker lived in this village that was raided by Maraudicons, an attack that led to their sister being killed. Now, as far as I know, they've never been pictured or featured anywhere else, but it's such an evocative name, you know? So I picture these guys as one of those cobbled together outcast groups, so none of them would actually look alike. There'd be really big, massive chungus ones and tiny little guys, and I love the idea of them having like a feral dog bar. And of course, they would roam the sand dunes, slaughtering any settlements and raiding any refineries they happened to come across. There was this kid's book called Autobot Alert that had a group called the Multi-Winged Jet Fighters. Now, they served under Galvatron that were numerous in number and also capable of spaceflight. And they helped Galvatron tear an Autobot shuttle to pieces, sending the Autobots inside just spinning, dead, lifeless into space. The Jet Corps were from the Japanese story pages, and they work for the High Regent Scrash. Not entirely sure who that is right now, but he's the type of character I will be looking into when I come to do my video ranking the supervillains, and were rivals to the Autobot Road Corps. They were Flarejet, this dude who could draw on the power of the sun, Moonjet, who would use the far side of the moon for cover as he sprang out for surprise attacks, Shadowjet, who had these kind of freeze powers and who wanted to freeze the whole planet Earth, and they were led by Darkjet, who had some sort of kind of like dark missile launcher that was supposed to be pretty powerful. IDW had the Mini-Constructicons, these three little guys created by Ramjet to build a device called the Universal Cybertronic Tracker, which, in a breach of privacy not seen since Facebook, could monitor every single Cybertronian on planet Earth. Ramjet killed two of the three just for shits and gigs, but he got his when Megatron smashed him to a bloody metallic pulp. It later came out that the next step of the Mini-Constructicon plan would have been to create Micro-Constructicons, to be injected into human bloodstreams to get some kind of control over them. Of course, that never came to pass because what happened to the last Mini-Constructicon, you ask? He went off and lived in a cabin on a mountainside, fell in love with a local girl, and spent his days farming hemp. I'm joking, he got brutally executed by Spike Witwicky. The Trailer Corps were Motormaster and Onslaught, and was so named because they both dragged trailers in vehicle mode and could form what they called the Decepticon Great Wheel, which, although may sound herpy, which was described as a whirling cyclone of destruction, a devastating swirling attack that could only be countered by Optimus and Ultra Magnus's Tri-Magnus Finish Double. Okay, I don't know what that is. The Decepticon Supersoldiers were a whole army of Tarns from another universe, one of whom gained sentience and tried to take everything over. He probably would have succeeded if not for my man Soundwave. The Seekers started out as a bunch of Starscream redecos before the Coneheads and some others were brought in to vary it up a bit. The first scene in G1 was Starscream, Thundercracker, and Skywarp, and they would later be joined by Dirge, Ramjet, and Thrust. But you know what? They weren't officially called Seekers until the Dreamwave continuity in like 2002. They were elite officers in command positions in the Decepticon army, expected to set the example in terms of loyalty and patriotism to the other troops. Apparently it was Starscream's suggestion that they all take on his body shape. Something that Skywarp would later theorize was to make it easier for him to hide if anyone came looking for the tax money he had defrauded. Now this leads us on to the Rainmakers, three unique Seekers who specialize in chemical and environmental warfare. And I'm talking about Iron Storm, who could generate EMPs, Acid Storm, who would trigger torrential downpours of highly concentrated acid rain, and Nova Storm, who has armor so thick she can walk in volcanic environments and even on the surface of stars. In the 2019 comics, they helped bring in Decepticonism by brutally murdering Sentinel Prime. And they did this by each doing what they did best. Iron Storm brought him down with an EMP, Acid Storm weakened him with his acid attack, before Nova Storm cut him in half with her wing as she flew through him. And then they all stood over him and went like, "You did nah." And then you have the Aerospace Extermination Squadron, or the Air Warriors, which are an even more mass-produced, even more disposable faction of flyers. For example, in the Dreamwave continuity, Megatron had a fleet of these guys that was reportedly 1 million strong that he used to enslave Earth. It turned out that he had obtained the cloning tech from the Quintessons, and they were eventually defeated when Perceptor used cyberstatic energy to attack their shared neural network. A similar but not the same group to be found in the Marvel comics was the Airborne Hunter Squad, which was put together under Shockwave's leadership when he reorganized the Decepticon army. They managed to corner a group of Autobots and demanded that the prisoners beg for their lives before they be executed. But luckily, Ultra Magnus arrived to help them out, which prompted the leader of the Airborne Hunter Squad to cave, start sobbing, and beg for his life at the feet of Rodimus. And you know what? Rodimus blew him away. Oh my god. Then in Transformers Animated, you had the Starscream clones, where Starscream took mechanical shells based on his own design and infused them with protoforms from Yokitron's dojo. Some of these were just clones, but others reflected certain aspects of Starscream's personality. For example, Dirge apparently represented Starscream's greed, Sunstorm seemed to be kind of the spineless ass-kisser, and Thrust was really jealous. Some of them had their higher functions disabled and spark chambers filled with explosives, turning them into suicide bombers. Some got stuck in cement, others were destroyed by Megatron when he deemed the whole thing just a miserable failure. There was also the Decepticon Air Corps from Transformers Cybertron. I think they weren't featured that much. They were also some of the first Transformers in the Bayverse, tasked with finding stars by the Dynasty of Primes to feed the Allspark. In the Big Looker storybooks, Megatron had his own rescue squadron. Basically, if anything happened to him, an alarm would go off and these guys would fly in and whisk him to safety. Also in the Big Looker books, Megatron once referred to him, Blitzwing, Bombshell, Longhaul, and Ravage as the Destructicons. Don't really know what was going on there, but in another reality, there was a group with the same name who conquered the whole reality. But because it was only an R-Spectre Prime thing, I doubt anyone really gives a shit. There was the Dirk Diggler team who all had massive oh wait, no, hold on, typo, it's Dirt Digger. The Dreads were these guys from Dark of the Moon, specializing in infiltration and assassination, and whose Earthbound contingent is made up of Crankcase, Crowbar, and Hatchet, who was destroyed during the highway chase, Crowbar was blasted by Ironhide, and Crankcase was facially impaled, let's just say. Now in the Dark of the Moon video game, there were the Assaulters, who had detection capabilities advanced enough to negate Mirage's cloaking shield. These guys were all modeled on Hatchet, but they may or may not have been led by a bot known as Enforcer, who was modeled on Crankcase. In another tech story called The Dark Heart of Sandokan, Astrotrain led the Minicon sabotage team on a variety of mercenary jobs. There were these 3 Minicons called Astro Hook, Astro Line, and Astro Sinker. Oh my god, that's funny! Hook, line, and sinker, do you get it? Funny! The Seek and Terminate Optimus Prime group was set up to seek and terminate Darth Vader. No, of course not. Right, let's talk fodder. Where would any evil army be without a cheap disposable force that's basically just there to soak up the enemy bullets? There were the Vehicons from Prime, sometimes also known as the Eradicons. They come in car, jet, tank, or truck variety, and they've been wrecked, experimented on, recycled, tortured, and maimed by both Autobots and their own Decepticons. They would pop up occasionally in the IDW continuity, but neither of these were the first Vehicons, as there was an earlier incarnation in Beast Machines. Same concept, except these guys were apparently either controlled by Megatron directly or a Vehicon general. Again, there were several types, including cycle drones, copter drones, mole drones, stealth drones, and demolition drones. I already spoke about the Predacons from Prime. I reckon they qualify as fodder pretty good, although they were quite a bit more powerful than the Vehicons. But the next on the list would be the Dino Force from the Japanese continuities. Simple-minded and pretty basic, they could be quite a powerful attacking force if the mission was kept simple enough. Raiding settlements and attacking freighters, for example. Seems like they had some sort of basic pretender tech too. I read that they could split themselves from their shells to increase their numbers if they needed to. As if Transformers wasn't confusing enough already with all these continuities, at one point in Generation 2, they decided that the Decepticons should have an offshoot branch, or descendants if you want to be more precise, to be called, of all things, Cybertronians. Yeah, as I said, they were like a second generation. They weren't born or forged or whatever, but born through a process called budding, which I think is like where the chromosomes or atoms or whatever are split to form two new ones. This meant that somehow any link they had to the essence of Primus was greatly reduced, and therefore they have a lessened sense of morality. They were created to bolster the Cons' troop numbers, and it's said that because of that lessened sense of morality, they didn't really care about the Decepticon cause either. But from what I've seen, there's more examples of them just being like properly abused, like G-Axis here is just breaking one's head open. Let's speedrun the Micromasters. The Racetrack Patrol were race cars, not to be confused with the Sports Car Patrol that were sports cars. The Constructor Squad built stuff, the Build Team also built stuff, also evolved from Cyberdroids. The Dark Skies Patrol were led by Windshear, whereas every member of the Airstrike Patrol was trying to become their leader. The Battle Squad loved their artillery fire, and the Military Patrol attacked New York. Okay, time for some combiners. The Constructicons have pretty much been a constant in Transformers over the years, with varying lineups, mainly being Mixmaster, the chemist of the group, Hook, who was an engineer, Bone Crusher, who's described as a berserker, Longhaul, the transporter, Scavenger, whose job it was to detect building materials, and their leader Scrapper, who designed their builds. But also, depending on the continuity, Gravedigger, Bone Crusher's brother, Hauler, Erector, Hightower, and Scoop, who was a religious fanatic. There was also Dirt Boss in Transformers Animated, who was a nasty little piece of work who came about when a forklift fused with a Headmaster unit and an All-Spark shard.
What are you cogs looking at?
In G1, which is kind of a mess because at one point it says that they built Megatron, but in another rep they were converted to Decepticons, but with the Robo Smasher, before Megatron later stated that he rebuilt them. I don't know, it's all kind of confusion. Best explanation I can come up with is that the writers just thought this was some dumb kids show and never thought that some web nerd would still be overthinking this shit 40 years in the future. But here we are. But basically they destroyed their own creation, they were pushed into a river of lava. They built a bunch of drone transformers out of common Earth cars, as well as a throne for Blitzwing made out of dead Autobots. They chopped up Optimus with a lightsaber and made him into a sewer gator. They also formed a trumpet band, and I'm sure they took part in many a parade and funerals and stuff. Apparently in the Bayverse, not all of the Constructicons are combiners, and it was explained in the comics that they were some of the earliest bots created. This continuity introduced some new ones like Demolisher and Skipjack, and the Aligned comics featured Long and Frontloader, although they weren't featured that much. Now Transformers Energon had the Constructicon team, which was Bone Crusher, Duststorm, Sledge, Wideload, and their leader Steamhammer. Now Steamhammer was kind of brighter than your average Constructicon, being really good at jamming signals, breaking codes, intercepting messages, and generally being a skilled comms op. Anyway, these guys would combine together to form Constructicon Maximus. Not to be confused with Energon's Destruction team, who combined into Bruticus Maximus, and they were made up of Blackout, Blight, Kickback, Stormcloud, and Barricade. The Combaticons were Vortex, Swindle, Blastoff, Brawl, and Onslaught, and combined into Bruticus. As with the other combiners, I talked about them quite a lot, right, cha? But in Rise of the Dark Spark, they were tasked with tracking down Shockwave after he went missing while he was transporting the Dark Spark, which was this evil equivalent of the Matrix of Leadership, or the Allspark, not sure which. Once they found him, the Autobots launched a desperate attack to stop the artifact falling into Megatron's hands, so Bruticus was dispatched to get his murder on, and he managed to force the Autobots to stand down. And crushed Cliffjumper against a wall in the process. You know what? I'm going to look into Rise of the Dark Spark on my gaming channel. Check that out if you haven't already. The Teracons have had a few incarnations. Let's start with Transformers Prime, where they were the revived husks of dead Transformers, brought back by the mysterious properties of Dark Energon. They were said to operate on pure instinct, with no mindful action to speak of, but were nonetheless unrelenting waves of destructive power for Megatron to set upon his targets. In Transformers Energon, they were mostly mass-produced drones created by Alpha Q, with a mission to help gather Energon to help repair Unicron. There were 4 main types, a puma and a bird, and later a dinosaur and a beetle. And I know these guys probably belong in the fodder section, but you know, they are called Terracons, so yeah. Then we have the Rise of the Beast Terracons, led by Scourge and scouting planets for Unicron to feed on. How they came across the Chaos Bringer is unknown, but it is known that they traded their servitude for dark powers and enhanced abilities. The Gen 1 Terracons were the animalistic troop who would occasionally ditch the cons for the Quintessence when it suited them, and could combine into the fearsome Abominus. In any war, control the roadways and you can restrict your enemy's ability to move troops, ordnance, and assets. And the Stunticons were in charge of controlling the roads. As a crazed band of carbots, they were led by the juggernaut that is Motormaster, and with the brutal Heatseeker, Wildbreak, who could emit energy waves, Dragstrip, who was kind of a schemer, and Slashmark, who had the ability to emit energy through his tires. They somehow destroyed an entire planetary system, and although it's an event that's never gone into in great detail, if the star systems were inhabited, it would have cost millions of lives. At least that was the lineup in the Aligned continuity. Elsewhere, they were Motormaster, Dragstrip, Dead End, Breakdown, and Wild Rider, who would of course combine into Menasor. In the Revenge of the Fallen video game though, They were kind of like Vehicons, mass-produced Decepticon body forms. The Seacons were the Cons Underwater Specialist Task Force. And with the Squid Tentacle, it was this kind of walking squid. Yeah, it was a bit weird. Scalor, this manta ray called Seawing. Overbite, this flying shark. Well, you know Overbite, he's a flying shark. Nautilator, who was this kind of clumsy and insecure, what was he again? Oh yeah, lobster, he was a lobster. And their leader, Snaptrap, who was this very angry turtle. And yeah, laugh if you want, but this guy has an unquenchable bloodlust and delights in the gutting of his prey. The Predacons formed Predaking, but were also a whole offshoot of the Decepticons that caused no end of trouble under the leadership of Beast Megatron, as well as being the super powerful ancient Transformers that were resurrected by Shockwave and Transformers Prime. They were kind of their own faction and not really Decepticons, but in Dreamwave's The War Within, the Decepticons splintered, as I mentioned before, and Starscream's new faction was christened Predacons as well. And they try to mess up Shockwave's truce with the Autobots by attacking the signing of the peace treaty. No! IDW's 2005 continuity mentioned the Combicons, which was one of the earliest attempts to create a combiner. Ambulon was one of these, Arm Or, Abdominus, Swing, and Kicker. And these guys were experimented on to within an inch of their lives, and eventually Ambulon would defect to the Autobots, and eventually would get cut in half by a chainsaw. I already mentioned the Four Guards, but did I mention that they combine into... What's the name again? Oh, yeah, obviously, Megatronia. They combine into Megatronia. The Commandos from Robots in Disguise were very similar to the Combaticons, even combining into the Ruination, which is basically just Bruticus. These guys started out as Autobot protoforms who Megatron corrupted with the energy of his Dark Spark. They were Mega Octane, Rotor, Armorhide, Rollbar, and Movor, and they'd regularly go up against the Spy Changers and Bullet Train, and were eventually shipped off to a prison colony on an asteroid. Way back when, Megatron saw how effective the Wreckers were, so he set up the Decepticon Heavy Brigade to counter and hunt them down. They were Bugly, Grind, Venom, and Blackout, and it doesn't sound like they lasted very long, because in the present day, Blackout was all that remained. We made it, guys. That was the long one. That's the longest video I've ever made. I doubt that there are very many people who are still watching at this point, but if you are... wow, thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you do happen to like these longer form things, I've got another hour-long special planned for the spring somewhere probably. And if you're even remotely interested in Godzilla, you're gonna love it. I'm not gonna say any more than that right now. I feel like I've taken up enough of your time, so let me just end by saying all the best for 2024, and please let me invite you to get out of my head, and I will see you very soon for the next one. Thank you very much for watching, and cheerio, bye!